Well, good morning. This morning, our committee meets again to explore ways to promote broadband investment and deployment. Before opening our discussion on infrastructure, I want to take a moment to welcome and thank our friends to the north for joining us here today. Our colleagues from the Canadian House of Commons, serving on the Standing Committee on Industry, Science and Technology, have joined us today to talk about how our two nations can learn from one another regarding improving broadband connectivity. The members of this committee extend a warm welcome to you, and we look forward to our continued dialogue on broadband policy. Improving our nation's infrastructure is a bipartisan goal that Congress and the administration share. In March, we heard from a diverse panel of witnesses who spoke of the issues facing our nation's infrastructure across several sectors of our economy. One of our witnesses, Shirley Bloomfield, speaking on behalf of NTCA, the Rural Broadband Association, offered insight about the benefits that stem from deploying and modernizing broadband infrastructure. As we all know, access to broadband is critical to everyday life and is a driving force behind much of the economic growth we've experienced over the last 2 decades. Particularly in rural areas like South Dakota, keeping up with the demand for access to broadband can be challenging. Rural communities, unfortunately, often lag behind their urban counterparts due to more challenging geographies and lower population density. To address this disparity, a major part of our continuing discussion on improving the nation's infrastructure should include solutions to reducing any unnecessary hurdles to broadband deployment. As we look to potential solutions, we must be mindful of the tremendous investment made to deploy these services and look for opportunities to help cut through red tape. For example, many wireless carriers are already deploying next-generation small cells that are the size of a pizza box, and thus reducing the need for larger towers and minimizing environmental impact. To help foster more deployment, we must ensure the regulatory regime in place is reflective of these advances in technology. Speeding up deployment will also come from eliminating unnecessary red tape and delays. As my colleagues from Alaska, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and other northern states already know, in places like South Dakota, you are lucky if you have a 6-month window to undertake the hard work of deploying broadband infrastructure, whether that's laying fiber, erecting towers, or building satellite earth stations. This makes any bureaucratic delay in securing permits even more damaging in states like ours. In South Dakota, for instance, Golden West Telecommunications has to start the permitting process 1 to 2 years before it can begin putting fiber in the ground, and sometimes even that is not enough. In April of 2015, Golden West began the process of securing permits to deploy fiber facilities in Custer, a mile-high city in the Black Hills with a population of about 2,000 people. Due to delays, particularly from the National Forest Service, Golden West didn't get the necessary approvals until this past November, some 18 months later. Well, on Monday, it was still snowing in the Black Hills. Nevertheless, after more than 2 years of waiting, Golden West is ready to start digging just as soon as the weather clears. In the meantime, a multi-million-dollar project has been on hold, good jobs have been deferred, and valuable internet service has been delayed. Today, I hope that we will explore ways to facilitate faster broadband deployment and avoid these unnecessary delays. We must be cognizant, however, of the role our local communities have in authorizing and managing the deployment of physical infrastructure. Many businesses serving these communities, like Midco in South Dakota, have developed great partnerships within their footprint, and we as policymakers want to encourage such relationships to thrive. A good starting point for addressing many of these issues is for the Senate to immediately take up and pass the Mobile Now Act, which this committee approved during our first markup in January. This bipartisan bill would streamline the process of applying for easements, rights-of-way, and leases for federally managed property and would establish a shot clock for review of those applications. Mobile Now would also establish a national broadband facilities asset database listing government property that could be used by private entities for the purpose of building or co-locating communications facilities. For all these reasons, it's my hope that in the coming weeks we'll finally see Senate passage of the Mobile Now Act. As Congress considers developing legislation to improve the nation's infrastructure, our discussion here today will help build a constructive record regarding America's digital infrastructure. I look forward to hearing from our distinguished panel today, and I want to thank you all for your willingness to testify. I'm going to turn now to Senator Nelson for any opening remarks he may have. Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and this is an important topic. We have neglected our infrastructure for so long, and of course, when we talk about infrastructure, it's not just roads and bridges. It's not just airports and seaports. It's the expansion of broadband. And I'm particularly pleased that Mayor Gary Resnick of Wilton, Manors, Florida, is here with us for the second time to provide a local perspective that is so important in this issue of expansion of high-tech broadband. It's clear that we're right here on the cusp of another leap forward in wireless communications. And also at the table this morning, a company, SpaceX, companies like this are preparing to launch innumerable satellites that basically will cover communications for the entire planet. Communications directly off of a satellite. So we're going to have innumerable opportunities. Territorial or terrestrial wireless companies are focused on deploying the next generation 5G wireless service. And that will provide many consumer benefits and likely serve as the backbone for our increasingly connected economy. And then the more we're connected, then the only thing we have to worry about, Mr. Chairman, is keeping the Russians out of all of our communications. So in looking at an infrastructure package, this committee has already talked about the necessity of direct spending for broadband expansion. So we're going to look today whether there are other non-monetary measures Congress could or should take to improve our nation's digital infrastructure. So many of us at the federal level, to the state level, to the local level, around the country want Americans to benefit from the availability of robust wireless. Building these networks has always brought up a number of very sensitive issues: historic preservation, environmental concerns, to state and local land use policies, tribal sovereignty, national security. And the advent of 5G brings with it networks that require installation of much denser wireless infrastructure made up of many more small facilities. So I hope that all of our stakeholders, including those represented here today, can work together to find ways to effectively balance all of these competing concerns. Now, with that said, I want to say something else about a different subject. The question many have asked me following last week's announcement by the FCC Chairman, Pai, that he intends to roll back the Commission's net neutrality rules. Where, they asked me, do we go from here as lawmakers? Well, I certainly believe American consumers deserve better than what the FCC chairman is proposing. They need to know, the consumers, that we have their back, and they deserve certainty and finality when it comes to their essential right to a truly free and open internet protected by clear, enforceable net neutrality rules. That lasting finality can only come from legislation, which the chairman and I have been talking about for a couple of years, which is why this senator has been open to finding a bipartisan solution on this issue. That solution cannot merely pay lip service to net neutrality, but it must include real protections for consumers and empower the FCC with flexible, forward-looking authority over broadband providers. Otherwise, we're going to be in this never-never land where the FCC will say something and then it'll be tied up in the courts for years and it'll go from one court to another. If we could ever get a bipartisan legislative solution, then that solves the problem. But, of course, that's not easy. Net neutrality legislation is not going to happen overnight, even when you have the kind of goodwill that the chairman and I do and the members of this committee do. The reality is that right now we're facing that there are too many folks, from Chairman Pai to the stakeholders and lawmakers, that are dug in on a particular side of this issue, so it's making compromise an impossible task. So this senator is an optimist by nature, but it's pretty clear to me that the climate just isn't ripe at the moment for a legislative solution that would lead to real substantive legislation that could garner sufficient bipartisan support. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be trying. And this senator will continue to try. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Nelson, and try we will. I think it's really important that Congress be heard from on this subject, and I think the actions being proposed by the FCC are, I believe, going to provide hopefully the necessary impetus for us to move forward with a legislative solution, because frankly, I think everybody here, we've batted this subject around a lot, realizes that the uncertainty created by constant lawsuits and changing administrations isn't something that's good for what has been a remarkable success story. And the internet and all that it's meant for our lives and our economy and the productivity that we see in the world today, we want to see that continue. We want to see that continued investment. And in order for that to happen, I think we've got to have certainty, and the best way to achieve that is through legislation. So I hope we can get there, and we're certainly committed to that end, and I'm glad to hear the senator from Florida indicate that he is as well. Let's proceed to our panel, and I want to start with Ms. Patricia Cooper, the Vice President of Satellite Government Affairs at SpaceX. She'll be followed by Mr. Larry Downs, the Project Director for the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy, Mr. Brian Hendricks, who's the Head of Technology Policy and Public Affairs for the Americas region for Nokia Corporation. This is a bit of a homecoming for Mr. Hendricks, who once served as the committee's Republican Staff Director for my predecessor, Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison. The Honorable Jeff Weninger, who's a state representative from the state of Arizona and has been doing some interesting work in this field, and the Honorable Gary Resnick, who, as the Senator Nelson mentioned, is the mayor of Wilton, Manors in Florida. And so and glad to have you back in front of this committee. Great panel. We'll start on my left and your right with Ms. Cooper. If you could confine your oral remarks to as close to 5 minutes as possible, enable us to get to questions, and we certainly want to give members of the committee an opportunity to ask those. So please proceed, Ms. Cooper.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Nelson, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to participate in this important and obviously timely hearing. As this committee reviews barriers to broadband deployment, SpaceX appreciates your consideration of the capability that new U.S.-based satellite constellations operating close to the Earth can contribute to closing the digital divide. In addition to my opening statement, I have prepared a detailed written statement, which I've submitted for the record. Mr. Chairman, I am pleased to be here today representing SpaceX. As you know, SpaceX has, from its inception, leveraged American innovation, technical savvy, and an upstart culture to provide the most advanced launch and spacecraft systems in history. With around 6,000 U.S.-based employees and a network of 4,400 suppliers nationwide, we're proud to provide a dependable and affordable ride to space for NASA, the Department of Defense, and the most sophisticated communication satellite operators in the world. Our innovation in launch technology has focused on achieving the holy grail of space access, reusability. And at the end of March, we successfully conducted the world's first reflight of an orbital class rocket. Looking forward, we intend to leverage our 15 years of experience toward a broadband satellite constellation. We plan to design, develop, produce, launch, and operate a constellation of 4,000 satellites. These will provide high-speed, low-latency, and affordable broadband to the underserved and unserved populations throughout the United States and abroad. This is an ambitious but vital objective. This committee knows well the broadband picture in our country today. The 34 million Americans without access to even basic broadband, 23 million of these in rural or remote areas, 41% of Americans living on tribal lands without broadband, and importantly, more than half of connected Americans with only one available broadband service provider. Today's hearing is about barriers to deploying broadband in America. SpaceX believes that the next generation satellite services will substantially alter the picture of broadband access and competition. My testimony will focus on the unique regulatory and spectrum-based barriers to bringing these systems online. Let me briefly describe the SpaceX satellite system and how we think it can contribute to the broadband challenge. Initially, the SpaceX system will consist of 4,425 satellites operating close to the Earth, with deployment starting in the next 5 years. On each spacecraft, we will apply cutting-edge space technologies that allow for spectrum reuse. The satellites in space will connect user terminals on rooftops with gateways interconnected with the terrestrial internet. In doing so, we'll be able to bring services to homes, schools, or businesses with just a rooftop terminal, a bit larger than a laptop. In short, adding a new user will just require minimal ground infrastructure, helping to address that last mile and alleviating the common terrestrial challenges of siting, digging trenches, laying fiber, and dealing with property rights. So what hurdles do satellite systems face? First, regulations for these non-geostationary satellite constellations are in desperate need of modernization. The FCC has recognized this and is currently building a record to update the rules. We applaud this and encourage the Congress to monitor this effort and press for new rules that encourage innovation and reward spectrum-efficient constellations. Second, SpaceX is concerned that spectrum use policies limit the potential for large constellations in space. Here, we recommend the government make as a priority access to key spectrum bands for these systems. Third, we ask Congress to ensure technology neutrality when assessing broadband infrastructure initiatives generally. In the past, satellite was largely overlooked as a technology, even though it offers the widest geographic reach. Given the promise of the next generation of satellite broadband, we urge that satellite be qualified alongside their analogs with terrestrial and mobile systems in any broadband program. Finally, in order to deploy large constellations, launch regulations at both the FCC and FAA need to be reformed. These regulations were written when commercial launches were rare. With commercial launch and now landings increasing in cadence to twice monthly and eventually weekly, it's time for an update. At the FCC, spectrum for commercial launches is licensed through multiple short-term temporary authorizations per launch. For the last 4 years, the FCC has been working to provide an allocation which would in turn streamline the licensing process. We encourage Congress to support the FCC's launch spectrum rulemaking and press them to finalize it. At the FAA, regulations on commercial space launches also need to be modernized and streamlined. We applaud this committee for recently holding hearings on this issue, and we encourage you to continue efforts to ensure regulations keep pace with industry and not stifle innovation. We're excited about the promise our satellite constellation can bring. Mr. Chairman, thank you for again for the opportunity to be here today. I would be pleased to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Cooper. Mr. Downs.
Well, thank you, and good morning, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Nelson, and members of this committee. I am grateful for the opportunity to testify this morning for you on barriers to broadband adoption and deployment at accelerated pace. Based in Silicon Valley, by the way, I'm also the author of several books on the information economy, innovation, and the impact of regulation on the speed and trajectory of technology innovation. Let me start with some good news. 20 years into the internet revolution, U.S. continues to dominate global markets for disruptive innovation, in large part because of far-sighted bipartisan policies from this committee and others. If we stay this course, future investments will make possible a new wave of innovation in everything from autonomous vehicles to smart cities, virtual reality, on-demand manufacturing, artificial intelligence, among many others. But as the saying goes, the future is already here, it's just not very evenly distributed. Driven by a combination of geographic, demographic, and educational factors, today's digital have-nots are characterized not by their race, sex, or income so much as by where they live. Americans in rural and tribal lands, as well as seniors and those with less education, are now the groups disproportionately disconnected from our increasingly important digital conversation, and we are all worse off for their absence. To close that gap, and in the spirit of nonpartisan cooperation, Blair Levin and I recently reviewed the history of U.S. broadband deployment and developed 8 specific recommendations for future infrastructure legislation. Levin, as this committee knows, directed the visionary National Broadband Plan, perhaps the most cost-effective investment of the entire 2009 stimulus bill. Now, these recommendations are hardly original. Well, they probably are in terms of Blair, but none of them are controversial. And happily, many of the best ideas would cost little or nothing in taxpayer dollars, but they do require your leadership to break long-standing logjams across government. In considering how best and most effectively to close this remaining availability and adoption gap, my overall advice to this committee is to learn from the success and failure of previous federal and local efforts, notably the 2009 American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. The bottom line here is simple. Accelerating deployment and adoption of broadband infrastructure for disconnected Americans will require some federal spending, but the spending needs to be done in a more focused and professional way than in the past to reach those who truly need help. And those efforts can be multiplied by encouraging the update of state and local processes, which in turn will provide incentives for private investors to reallocate even more of their own capital in ways that ultimately benefit everyone. Let me just very briefly list our specific recommendations, which I describe in my written testimony in the record. Number 1 is to limit and carefully control direct investments. We suggest creating a broadband acceleration fund, but use it only in areas where there is currently no provider. We want to determine the needed subsidies on a per-area basis and have one agency, preferably the FCC, be the sole administrator. And we suggest using general appropriations to fund that program rather than increases to the universal service fee. Second is to severely limit ongoing support. We want to change the paradigm of small capital support with uncertain ongoing operating subsidies to one that strongly favors areas where initial capital would be sufficient to overcome excessively high costs, and then use reverse auctions to maximize the bang for taxpayer buck in those areas. Number 3, extend dig once. This committee has already looked at this and has made great progress. We agree ensuring broadband conduit is installed whenever federal roads are dug up for any reason, and to the extent possible, extending that policy to state roads and rights of way. Number 4, address other unproductive barriers to mobile deployment. While local authorities, of course, continue to ensure public safety and other local interests, most of what slows down installation of new equipment promotes no public interest, in fact, quite the opposite. Treating small cell antenna installation on utility poles and buildings, for example, as if they were full-scale tower builds really serves no public goal. Shot clocks, uniform pole attachment policies, and other best practices should be established, I think, at the federal level. Number 5, re-engineer government processes that hinder private investment. Many local processes for application review and inspection are ad hoc, creating unneeded delays and costs that hold back deployment. For both wired and mobile builds of next-generation networks, these must be standardized. The problem is not local regulation so much as local process, or really the lack thereof. Number 6, make investments technology neutral. Next-generation mobile networks and satellite-based solutions, as you just heard, they will be truly competitive in both speed and reliability with fiber, cable, and copper hybrid technologies, which are also improving. So federal programs, including Lifeline, should encourage development and deployment of all broadband technologies. Number 7, address non-financial causes of the digital divide. Availability and price have really largely been solved through public and private solutions. Surveys now consistently show that those who remain part of the digital divide, again, the rural, senior, and less educated Americans, are unlikely to take broadband at any price. Public education about the relevance of broadband and training in basic computer usage may not cost much, but without them, any money spent will at least be partly wasted. And then finally, use the bully pulpit to encourage digital whatnots. The National Broadband Plan laid out a vision of America's broadband future, which has largely come to be or will soon, but neither the White House nor the FCC communicated that vision to digital whatnots. The FCC should take an updated plan on the road, along with startups and established companies who are making the vision a reality. Now, in Silicon Valley, this is what we call a win-win-win. And I'm happy to expand on any of these points and look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Downs. Mr. Hendricks.
Well, thank you, Chairman Thune, Ranking Member Nelson, members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation to share Nokia's thoughts on how to encourage broadband deployment. As the Chairman mentioned, I am an alum of the committee and had an occasion to exchange notes with Senator Hutchison yesterday. She sends her regards to all of you. I also got the impression she thought this might be karmic retribution for all the hearings I made her sit through. So please be kind. We commend the committee for your work on the Mobile Now Act. Nokia is very supportive of that legislation, particularly the spectrum provisions. We think that this and your continued interest in creating spectrum opportunities are important in building a foundation for investment in the technologies that will enable a truly connected society. The good news, as Professor Downs mentioned, is we have excellent broadband networks in the United States. They are just not deployed everywhere we want them, and they will require massive investments in order to evolve further in support of the use cases that we are contemplating for the connected, programmable world. These include things like connected healthcare, intelligent transportation, and smart cities. As I note in my written testimony, the technical challenges we face in supporting emerging demands are considerable. We will need peak data rates to get much higher. We will need to drop latency, which is the delay in transmission in networks, to near zero, to ensure that applications with no fault tolerance like autonomous driving vehicles and remote medical treatment will work reliably. The size and cost of the infrastructure we deploy must be smaller, while at the same time delivering higher functionality such as mobile edge computing and analytics. Tens of billions of dollars of investment is required in research and development and in the deployment of new infrastructure and software to grow capacity and coverage of our networks. Many different technologies, including Wi-Fi, multiple generations of wireless networks, and satellite must work together to form a comprehensive technology framework. The good news is there are hundreds of entities, large and small, willing to make this investment. We need to help assure that their intentions become the reality. We need to think very carefully about regulatory policies and understand their impact on the cost of deployment and the type of returns investors can realize on those deployed assets. Rational actors don't make uneconomic investment. So key to encouraging investment will be ensuring an opportunity for innovative products, pricing, and new revenue sources. We need to avoid policy shocks that disrupt planned investment, such as making changes to the tax code, such as those proposed in the House. I mentioned this more extensively in my testimony, but the single greatest impediment to broadband infrastructure investment that this Congress could conceive would be to adopt limitations to interest deductibility. Many providers of broadband services use the debt market to finance their acquisition and deployment of technology, and tens of billions of dollars will ultimately be drained out of that opportunity. We recognize that the tax reform you're looking at is a comprehensive set of trade-offs. We recommend highly that that not be one of them that you consider. We need to continue finding ways to improve access to federal land and assets. Whether you're a fan of shot clocks or would prefer other avenues to streamline the process, such as requiring agencies to permit multi-site applications to allow for the reduction of duplicative impact studies and reduce legal costs, it's clear more can be done. We're encouraged by the committee's work in this area, and we follow the developments quite closely, including many of the ideas that Senator Heller has recently put forward. In addition, we need the FCC to move forward aggressively with its proceeding on siting challenges and to use its Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee as a place to bring together stakeholders, including industry, states, cities, and towns, to identify the best practices and a plan for replicating them in jurisdictions across the country. It would be beneficial for Congress to clarify and bolster the authority of the FCC, particularly as it relates to the range of structures and locations covered under Section 253 of the Communications Act and the reasonableness of fees and charges. We note there are several ways to do that, any one of which can greatly improve upon our recent experience. We should continue to refine programs within congressional and federal purview that can assist with the affordability of certain infrastructure deployments and ultimately end-user connections. Nokia would like to see broadband as a focus in the upcoming infrastructure bill, and we would encourage you to prioritize funds towards early deployments of IoT verticals like smart city, connected and intelligent infrastructure, and connected healthcare. We think that doing so will help considerably with the demonstration of the value proposition to broadband consumers and improve adoption rates. Higher uptake is a key way to improve the business case for broadband deployment, particularly in rural areas. Finally, let me say that Nokia has frequent interaction with stakeholders across the country. As we worked in support of FirstNet's outreach to states and to ascertain the availability of infrastructure for that massive undertaking, we learned a great deal about who is investing in broadband technology, the state of the infrastructure, and how investment decisions are made. As you consider ways to address the challenges of rural broadband deployment, I would encourage you to make sure you continue hearing from those that face those challenges most directly. They often do not have Washington offices, and they may come here once or twice a year. But co-ops, as one example, provide broadband coverage to 40% of the nation's land mass with only 5% of its population. Understanding the solutions necessitates understanding the problems. We think they can offer some critical insights and should be part of this conversation. Thank you. I would be happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hendricks. Mr. Weninger.
Chairman Thune, Ranking Member Nelson, members of the committee, it is a true honor to be speaking to you today. As mentioned, my name is Jeff Weninger. I'm a state representative in Arizona, and I, along with my colleagues, especially Senator Fan and Senator Smith, passed and got signed by the governor House Bill 2365 this year, which did a lot of things that are being talked about, shot clocks, and just created a great environment, we think, going forward. Today, you can look down any crowded street in America and at a glance see multiple people, young and old, looking at their smartphones or tablets, following online maps, checking Instagram, Snapchat, or Facebook, watching YouTube or Netflix, video chatting on Skype or FaceTime, or accessing one or more countless apps. My mother lives in a retirement community. She used to have a wired internet connection with a desktop computer. Last year, she got rid of it. Now she sits in her chair for a couple hours a day in the living room and accesses Facebook and email through her smartphone. Hearing this, it's not hard to understand that mobile data usage is skyrocketing. According to Cisco, in 2016 alone, U.S. mobile data traffic grew 44% and is expected to grow fivefold from 2016 to 2021. Big events cause people to use their mobile devices even more. At the Phoenix Open Golf Tournament in February of this year, for just one carrier, mobile data use was equivalent to 26 million selfies. That same carrier had a 60% increase with roughly the same amount of people from the very year before at the tournament. All this is the fun stuff, but mobile devices are critical to more serious matters. According to Pew Research Center, 40% of cell phone users said they found themselves in an emergency situation in which having their phone with them helped. And the FCC reports that 70% of 911 calls are from wireless phones. My father lives in Tucson and only has a wireless phone. He does not have a wired phone or a landline. In the last year, he has had to call 911 twice for an emergency. For his sake and the sake of all Americans, it's critical that these devices work when we need them the most. While these phones, tablets, and apps seem magical, they don't run on magic. They run on hardware and software connected to antennas and ultimately fiber optic cables, and all of this is installed on towers and poles and in underground conduits. In other words, they require infrastructure. And more of that infrastructure will be in the form of small cells, which are placed on utility poles, street lights, signs, bus shelters, and traffic signals, and are designed to blend into the existing environment. FCC Chairman Powell recently said the future of wireless will evolve from large macro cell towers to include thousands of densely deployed small cells operating at lower power. These small cells are necessary to meet today's customers' needs, but they are even more important for the next generation of wireless networks, 5G. We're meeting today's needs and preparing for that future in Arizona, where we just passed a landmark bill that promotes needed investment in small cells while ensuring the appropriate level of local control. Arizonans will know that when they want to use the mobile devices, the infrastructure will be there to support them. You may have heard that sometimes there are conflicts between wireless carriers, cities, and towns over how and where these small cells will be built. But in Arizona, we have the support for the bill from the industry players and also from the Municipal Association, the Arizona League of Cities and Towns. How did we get there? Simple. We had many productive discussions about how to address the concerns of the cities and towns and others while ensuring the right policy framework for investment. The bill ensures that there is a uniform statewide policy for wireless carriers to get the necessary permits and agreements from Arizona cities and towns. And those cities and towns are able to ensure that small cells meet their local codes for public safety, design standards, and concealment requirements. If the wireless carrier wants to attach to municipal poles, like street lights, the bill ensures that carriers will pay appropriate fees for that attachment. In summary, I'm very proud that Arizona's new bill is a great example of how the state, cities, towns, and industry can all work together to meet a shared goal of ensuring that the needs and demands of citizens for broadband networks will be met. And as I'm efficient and believe in shot clocks, I think I finished just in time.
Nicely done. Thank you, Mr. Weninger. Mr. Resnick.
Good morning, Chairman Thune, Ranking Member Nelson, and members of the committee. I am Gary Resnick, Mayor of the City of Wilton, Manors, Florida, and an active member of the National League of Cities and the National Association of Telecommunications Officers and Advisors. And I want to thank both NLC and NATOA for their support with my testimony and their support with these issues over the years. In addition to my public service, I am an attorney with the law firm of Gray Robinson and head up our broadband practices group. And I want to thank you for the opportunity again to share our perspectives from local government leaders across the country. I also want to thank the committee and in particular Senator Nelson. We Floridians are very lucky to have you representing us, sir, for calling attention to the importance of broadband deployment. As both an elected official and the past chair of the FCC's Intergovernmental Advisory Committee, I can assure you that no one cares more about competitive broadband choices than local governments. We are not just regulators, but we are large consumers and understand how important reliable, competitive broadband is for our local economies and our residents. As with other new technologies over the years, the incredible success in rolling out broadband has made it a disruptive technology. It challenges the resolve of all stakeholders, including local governments and industry members, to remain cooperative partners. If we as a nation will succeed in providing all businesses and residents from Miami, Florida to Miami, Texas, with excellent, affordable, reliable service, local governments and service providers must remain cooperative partners, and federal support for that partnership is essential to deploying successfully the infrastructure needed for broadband. For years, cities and towns like mine have worked proactively with both service providers and infrastructure companies to support broadband technology. As city leaders, though, we must also balance other important needs of our communities. Our current policy framework supports us in that role, and that's why broadband service and infrastructure has been able to expand so rapidly. In my community of Wilton Manors, we have supported both service providers and infrastructure companies, including allowing the use of public property, and we, along with many other local governments, are updating our codes to support access for small cell technology in our public rights-of-way. We have even attempted, in conjunction with transportation construction projects, to deploy broadband infrastructure for use by the industry. However, currently federal and state policies prohibit us from doing so. When local governments do restrict broadband infrastructure, trust me, there are very good reasons, particularly when dealing with requests to install facilities in the public rights-of-way. We are stewards of the public rights-of-way. Our codes exist to ensure that the rights-of-way remain safe for all who are impacted by their use, including our first responders, utilities, the traveling public, and adjacent property owners. We cannot sacrifice these other important interests for one particular use. There are some concerns with managing the public rights-of-way that are more important to us in Florida than perhaps in other areas. We pay a price in Florida to live in paradise, with severe hurricanes, storms, flooding, and lightning strikes. Any public works director will tell you that with these environmental challenges, it makes absolute sense to construct utilities underground. Not only does this improve aesthetics and increase property values, it provides much more reliable utility service and allows first responders and residents to use streets during and after these emergencies rather than waiting sometimes days or weeks until downed power lines are cleared. Taxpayers in many communities throughout the state have approved referenda to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to underground existing overhead utilities, including recently the town of Palm Beach. The same reason for not favoring overhead utilities applies to broadband infrastructure that may be located in the rights-of-way. In addition, in Florida, it is vital for our Department of Transportation and cities and counties to maintain what's known as clear zones adjacent to roads. Our roadways often border waterways, and the only safe way to pull off a road to avoid an accident and not get submerged is to have no fixed facilities along such roads. Clear zones, are essential for public safety, not only in Florida, but I understand in communities that suffer from heavy snows and ice as well. My reasons for discussing these concerns is to show that our local codes address very practical issues. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. Local regulation is the only system that works. Unfortunately, there are proposals on the table now that would preempt and minimize cities' roles and reduce our ability to ensure the safe, responsible deployment of infrastructure. Federal policies that preempt local authority to support certain technologies or competitors risk producing winners and losers. These industries are very competitive. If it suddenly became cheaper, faster, easier for a company to deploy its technology, it would create unfair competitive advantages. Finally, if Congress preempts local authority over public rights-of-way, local taxpayers would be forced to subsidize the broadband industry. Much of the dialogue occurring in the states and at the FCC would allow wireless providers to attach their equipment to government-owned light poles for as little as $15 per year. These are very expensive. My city just spent over $210,000 to install new light poles, and it would not be fair for our taxpayers to pay for this public property to be used virtually for free. As a mayor, if I give business such perks, my constituents would expect a great deal in return. We have several policy recommendations for the committee that are more dealt with in detail in my written statement. First, the federal government should prioritize local decision-making on infrastructure. Second, Congress should tackle federal barriers to infrastructure deployment. The Mobile Now Act goes a long way to doing that. Third, Congress should allow local governments to use every tool in its toolbox. And finally, we should consider appropriate education for broadband users. Our first responders are constantly reminding residents that they cannot text to 911 or post an emergency on social media instead of calling 911. In conclusion, on behalf of the NLC, NATOA, and the City of Wilton Manors, I wish to thank the committee for inviting me to participate in this hearing today. America's local governments are committed to supporting Congress in increasing broadband deployment, and I look forward to any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you. I just made a meteoric leap to the chair's chair. So nice to be here. Well, thank you. I want to thank Chairman Thune. Obviously, we were just called for a vote. He's gone to vote, and he's yielded me the time to make my statement and ask some questions. I'm not going to reiterate all the benefits of broadband. I'm from a state, West Virginia, that has challenges that many of our states have. I appreciate Ms. Cooper's testimony when she references the GAO report that says states' access to affordable broadband telecommunications is vital to economic growth and improved quality of life for the country. So we need to have it easily accessible and to try to help those areas who have been unserved. So today I want to announce I am going to be introducing a bill called the Gigabit Opportunity Act, which it builds on Chairman Pai's idea and vision of gigabit opportunity zones. It seeks to expedite the deployment of broadband in low-income rural areas. And in the GO Act, the FCC would be directed to release a framework to streamline broadband laws that states, counties, and cities, and we've heard the myriad of different hoops that have to be jumped through. But once adopted, I think governors would be able to nominate portions of their states' low-income areas as gigabit opportunity zones. So I hope my colleagues on both sides will join with me to get the flexibility and the streamlining of existing regulations. Mr. Downs, in your testimony, you mentioned that the unintended consequences of unfocused investments, and you mentioned the the stimulus package in 2009. Certainly in West Virginia, we had a major investment, and we're still 49th in deployment. Encouraging broadband has been, not having the competition that we need. The burdensome regulations obviously are holding us in the way. What suggestions, besides what you have in your written statement, would you put forward for future investments if and when we get to an infrastructure package and includes broadband? You mentioned a $20 billion, and you mentioned that FCC should be in charge rather than having the 3 different pockets. Would there be anything else you'd add to that statement?
Yes, so, and thank you, and I had an opportunity, Senator, to look at your draft legislation, and it was very encouraging, so I hope it does move forward.
Thank you.
So obviously, we know that some of the broadband stimulus money was spent better than others, and I think one of the things we learned even from all 3 different bureaus is that we have to watch these projects more closely and more professionally, frankly, and make sure that when we make a loan or we make an investment to a private party to do an infrastructure build, we can't just leave it alone. We have to watch them, because a lot of these projects got into trouble. Some of the contractors were not very experienced, and they just were allowed to go on and spend money and deliver nothing. So I think much more professional management, and as I say, so far the FCC did the best job, but they could use a lot of help as well.
One of the areas I've struggled with is the way that broadband deployment is reported and measured. For instance, if you have the census tracts, you can have an entire tract, and if you serve one person in this or one household in the census tract, then that census tract is considered served in some reporting. Do you have a concern as well as to the actual data that we're receiving as to who is getting this service and who isn't?
Yes, I do. I agree that the measurement by census tract is obviously not the best. And it goes the other way too. You start to see things that look like they're unserved based on the sort of the criteria that the FCC and others use to determine what constitutes broadband, how much latency is allowed, and so on. That, frankly, has excluded satellite up till now. So I think we can do a much better job of pinpointing just where the real problems are. But as you know, we already have a pretty good idea of the unserved communities and the underserved communities and where they are, and that should be the focus.
Do you find, though, a bit of a disconnect into what your definition of underserved might be? For instance, the CAF2 money is going to providers to go to underserved and unserved areas, and I've been pushing, at least in my state, to make sure that we go to unserved, because it doesn't really do as much good, I don't think, to up somebody's speed or before somebody even has availability of the service. Do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. The unserved communities ought to be the focus, certainly, of any actual federal spending. In fact, that should be the exclusive focus. And we should, use this reverse auction process once we figured out what the real investment requirement would be to get over the high cost, to find, the least cost provider and do it in a way that maximizes the public spend.
Thank you. And Mr. Weninger, I would like to say our state and our governor just signed a broadband bill under a kind of controversial circumstances, so I want to take the opportunity to thank him, Governor Justice, for signing it in the legislatures that put it into effect, and I'll be interested to see how it compares with what you all have done in Arizona. So thank you for being here today to bring that forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Cooper, this is exciting. You're going to put up 4,000 plus satellites. You're going to cover every part of the globe. Tell me how you're going to get along with the ones that put the pipes down that run into the houses. Are you directly competing against them, or are you going to cooperate with them and concentrate in the areas that they can't serve with 5G?
Thank you, Senator. The constellation we're planning to build will cover the globe pretty equally. So the service will be available globally, where we can manage our landing rights and develop our capacity on space. The business we plan to develop is meant to go direct to consumers. Those consumers who seek to subscribe, we would seek to serve. We are still several years away from deploying that service, I would expect that there would be significant uptake in areas that have no service now, but we also expect in areas where there are relatively few consumers with choice that we would be a new competitor entering the market. That, I think, is a question that will unfold in the years as we become closer to service rollout.
Okay, more competition. Mr. Mayor, you have testified that you don't want the feds to mess around with the state and local regulations on putting up the expansion of broadband. So explain more in detail, what do you think about the FCC rulemaking that they are considering? And if they adopt what they're considering, what impact is that going to have on the states and cities have already made on wireless siting?
Well, the success in rolling out broadband over the years. Thank you, Senator Nelson. The success in rolling out broadband over the years has been made possible by the current framework of local regulation. Macro towers have been deployed effectively throughout the entire country. Virtually everybody around the country has access to wireline broadband, also made possible through local regulation. The FCC's proposed NPRMs to potentially preempt local authority would have, I think, devastating effects on the industry and on the choices available for consumers. What local regulations show is that a one-size does not fit all. It's not possible. And it also tends to pick winners and losers. If we create incentives or give special treatment for small cell, which, by the way, is not small. There's been a lot of talk about small cell. That term refers to the size of the coverage. It doesn't refer to the size of the facilities. Some of our communities have been approached by companies wanting to put 120-foot poles in the rights-of-way, accompanied by refrigerator-sized equipment cabinets. They are not small. They just provide service over a very small area. So that's the term. It's small cell. It means the size of the distance of the service that it can reach, not the size of the facility. They are definitely not the size of pizza boxes. But companies like SpaceX that want to innovate with new technology should be encouraged. And if we adopt policies that preempt local authority solely to encourage more small cell facilities being built in our rights-of-way, what's it going to do for innovation? It's going to discourage innovation. It's going to favor one competitor over the others, and it's going to basically create winners and losers. So that type of policy that would preempt local regulation would not be a very good model to follow. The local regulations, however, have encouraged innovation. For example, local governments can require co-location as opposed to building new towers. That does encourage innovation because the industry has to become more creative about how to obtain the signal as opposed to just building new towers everywhere. Also, there's innovation now where there's technology that can use actually manhole covers to provide the same type of coverage that small cell technology provides. Local governments can require stealth and camouflage requirements with respect to this technology. If the FCC preempts those types of local initiatives, it's going to discourage innovation, it's going to hurt certain competitors that are entering the business, and we don't think it's appropriate.
Okay. Madam Chairman, I'm going to go vote, and I will ask them to hold the vote for you until you can get there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The chair is back, so I will.
Feel free to keep going.
I need to go vote. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for your patience and your indulgence. And members of Parliament from the North, thank you for being here. You get to witness what is our experience when we have votes going on in the middle of hearings. So thank you for being here. Let me pick up. I know that there have been a few questions asked already by my colleagues, but as I made clear in the situation in Custer, South Dakota, that I mentioned in my opening remarks, unnecessary bureaucratic delay in securing permits wastes time and deprives consumers of critical services. So, Mr. Downs, in our efforts to streamline deployment, we don't want to step on local interests or discourage experimentation, but we do want to identify where logjams exist, like along the lines of what we're experiencing in Custer and South Dakota, that serve no public interest. And so the question is, you know, can you comment on your findings with regard to some of the practices that you found wasteful?
Sure, and I thank you, Senator, for the question. I don't think that this is an all or nothing, or it's not black and white. I think there's lots of things at the local level that are specific to the locality, and also we've seen, I think, in the example of the build out of Google Fiber and now other gigabit fiber services, we see what happens when localities are incentivized to experiment. They get, you know, their competitive spirit gets up, and they start to discover, you know, a lot of things about their practices that don't make sense or just don't fit in that environment, and they get rid of them. And certainly, as we move into 5G, we're going to see a lot of communities saying, states and localities saying, you know, we want 5G, we want to be leaders in this innovation. It's an opportunity for economic growth, and we're going to experiment in ways that we can to get it in as quickly as possible. At the same time, there's just there is a lot that's wasteful. I live in an unincorporated community in Contra Costa County in California. The county people are very efficient, they're very professional, they have their rules and regulations, but as soon as there's even the hint of, you know, a new antenna going up on an existing utility pole, we've got all sorts of sort of ad hoc local authorities and people who get involved in the process, and that's usually where the delay is coming from. They don't know what they're debating about, they think they're talking about a full tower install when they're not, and that just is part of what drags things out. As I say, it's not the regulations, it's the lack of uniform process. Even just having the inspector, you know, show up when he's supposed to, if they don't, then, you know, we can have very expensive delays for no good reason. So I think there's that kind of waste that's easy to get out, and I think that's really what the FCC is getting at in the latest NPRM, not to foreclose local interests.
Let me direct this one, if I might, to Mr. Weninger. And by the way, congratulations on the bill 2365 that you had passed in Arizona. Your bill was aimed at streamlining infrastructure policies at all levels of government to pave the way for the deployment of next-generation wireless services to the people in your state. It is particularly noteworthy, I think, that your bill earned the support of the League of Arizona Cities and Towns. And so I'm wondering what lessons that we can learn as federal policymakers from how state and local authorities in Arizona worked together to speed the deployment of next-generation services. Maybe you could talk about how your legislation, how you worked with and reached out to and created a sort of an integrated approach among all the levels of government in your state.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, the inner workings of that was about 20 stakeholder meetings that were very intense in the beginning and did get heated. But once we figured out what each side really wanted, what the industry wanted and what the local governments wanted, it got easier. Local governments were concerned about some of the other things brought up here, concealment, aesthetics, public safety. So we addressed those and gave a lot on that. The industry is very concerned with price and speed, so the shot clocks. We instituted and settled on a 75-day shot clock and essentially about $200 total when you added up the 50, and then a $100 fee. But I think it's important within that framework that with the shot clock, if you look at some of the things that were happening before, we had Verizon took 3 years to get 9 master lease agreements in place with 9 different cities. And when you have these companies coming in and putting forward millions and millions of dollars in infrastructure, and you have hundreds of cities and towns that have all different rules, all different fee structures, you're never going to be able to keep up with technology. You're always going to be behind, and you're always going to have people who are lacking. We all came together, but one reason we did all this is because there were some people who were dragging this process out. One city has put up 71 of these, and in every case, they said they had to have an inspector. They were charging thousands of dollars. They were essentially charging the same amount, inspections and everything that you do for the large cell towers. And in all 71 cases of those poles, they made the company replace them anyway. So the company had to buy them a brand new pole and had to wait for 6 months to a year to ever even get it up. But in the end, and I will submit to you that the Arizona League of Cities and Towns was great to work with, but this is not, you know, a conservative organization. But we worked hard with them, and we figured out what both sides wanted and needed, and in the end, they weren't just neutral. They supported the bill, which again got out of the legislature unanimously out of both houses, and the governor signed.
Mr. Hendricks, again, welcome back to the committee. I notice you have something at your feet, and I'm told it may be a small cell, so maybe you could tell us a little bit about that piece of equipment and show us what you brought with you today.
Certainly, Mr. Chairman, and I think it's particularly important given Mayor Resnick's comments moments ago about small cells not being small. This is a fairly typical Nokia small cell. They come larger. They also come as small as a drink coaster. They come with capabilities to transmit from a few meters up to a few kilometers on the basis of the particular technology and software that is on board. One thing that is, I think, very important to understand as our friend from Arizona was just outlining about how regulatory costs impact deployment. Not even taking some of the more outrageous examples that we have seen, a $3,000 site inspection fee to put this on a pole, $2,500 a month, or $2,500 initial charge for the attachment, $1,500 a month in recurring charges, makes this a $22,000 enterprise just in regulatory costs to get it put on a pole. That doesn't include labor, that doesn't include getting power to it or backhaul to it, or the costs of going through the regulatory process. So if we were to deploy, again, fairly modest, 200 of these in a city, that's $4.5 million in cost just to get it on a pole and keep it there for a year. We think that we need to do considerably better than that. We've also seen, and I outline this in my testimony, some great partners. Nokia has great partners with communities. We serve 30 or so municipal broadband systems. We're a major partner in the FirstNet project that will be building the wireless network. So we have great experience and great partners. But we also have encountered extraordinary problems jurisdiction to jurisdiction, some places that have no process at all so that you don't know where to begin, some places where 5 agencies will be involved in seriatim looking at the application, the costs and fees that are associated here, the advent of third parties who have been coming in to negotiate on behalf of cities for these agreements have sprouted up kind of like crabgrass in the spring. And they have revenue sharing arrangements with the city that are designed to extract as much as possible for the cost of placing these facilities. All of those things take the cost of the deployment well beyond, in many cases, what makes the project viable. And the timelines are also an issue. So,
okay. Thank you. We appreciate that. Senator Fisher?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Weninger, you talked about some of the changes that Arizona has recently made with your bill regarding wireless broadband deployment. The Nebraska legislature is working on legislation to ensure the infrastructure necessary for these new technologies is available. In the broader context, what do you see as the role of states in working with federal, local, and also private entities to reduce the barriers to broadband deployment?
Thank you, Senator. Well, one thing I thought was interesting as I was coming here was looking over one of your bills, which was kind of mapping out federal and government facilities, and I thought that was interesting because in a lot of these more rural communities and different parts, there is a lot of times government infrastructure and government buildings and government workers. Sometimes in our communities, they're the largest employer in some of those rural communities. So I thought that was important. But yeah, I think the state's always, hopefully we can work with you like we worked in Arizona with the cities to help get this done. It's just, I keep coming back to this, and I like using real-world examples. It's just so important for everybody, rural and low-income neighborhoods and everywhere else. I mean, when I go back to my hotel tonight, using data, I'm going to FaceTime with my daughter and be able to talk to my daughter pretty much in real time like I'm there. I mean, technology's advancing so quickly, and I'm one who embraces it and thinks it's amazing, and anything we can do for you as a state or to work with the federal government or Nebraska, I think is a good thing.
Thank you. And Mr. Downs and Mr. Hendricks, as we look at new technologies, for example, the Internet of Things, that's going to require obviously smaller facilities, and those have differences with the current, as you just showed us some of the smaller cell capabilities that we have available now. When we're looking at these new technologies, how different are the siting policies going to be from the large towers, and how are we going to educate stakeholders to be able to deal with this both at the state and the local level about the importance that we have these rational siting ordinances? How are we going to move ahead on this?
Why don't you go first?
Thanks. The first thing I would say, Senator, and thank you for the question, is earlier we heard about the major deployment successes we've had on broadband in the past, particularly with wireless. Interestingly, when I was here on the committee and we worked on a major piece of legislation, we passed comprehensive reform to macro cell tower siting that streamlined things. And the evidence from the field is considerable that that was a major component in very fast deployment of 4G LTE technology. So the lesson learned there is when you have rational policies that help to eliminate huge differences place to place, you can get ubiquitous deployment quickly. We think that's true here also. But we also think that when you're talking about adapting your local ordinances to accommodate densification of a network with small cells, that may be hundreds and hundreds of deployments in a city, you can't look at it from the perspective of requiring an individual application for every small cell site. You need to allow things like multi-site applications so that you can take care of it at once and you can reduce impact study consequences and costs, and you can have one site inspection fee assessed instead of $3,000 per small cell. So we do have to change the way we think about these deployments because there is a major difference between a $400,000 macro tower with everything including a diesel generator that is deployed there and the small cell that I just showed you.
Right. Mr. Downs, did you have anything?
Yeah, I would just add that, I mean, one of the things that's going to be also important about 5G deployment is this is going to be a technology that's going to evolve and change very rapidly. And so it's also going to be important not to penalize providers when they upgrade equipment or change equipment. If that's treated as it's a brand new install, that will slow things down inordinately and obviously discourage better, faster, cheaper service.
So you would think at the federal level, we also need to be aware that changing technologies will require us to have a different view of the regulations that are in place?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, again, what I suggest is, you know, just learning from the local and the federal, just best practices, put that into legislation. That is sort of the minimum standard, obviously leaving locals to you know, play with opportunity zones or other kinds of experimentation beyond that, but just have a baseline of sort of minimum requirement for flexibility. That's really going to help everybody.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Fisher. Senator Schatz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you for scheduling this hearing on broadband infrastructure deployment. Improving people's access to the internet is critical to economic and social development, but it also matters what kind of internet people have access to. And so just very briefly, Chairman Pai is making a mistake with repealing the open internet order, which will undermine the internet as we know it. The internet is not broken, and there is no constituency to repeal the open internet order. My first question is for Ms. Cooper. I found your testimony fascinating. Satellite internet is often associated with low speeds, high latency, high prices. You have asserted that SpaceX essentially changes the paradigm. How?
Thank you, Senator. We have a couple ideas. First, we want to bring the satellites closer to Earth. By bringing them closer to the Earth, the latency required in the system to get to the satellite and back to the Earth is reduced considerably. Our system, we think, will have latencies below 35 milliseconds, whereas traditional satellite services are in the hundreds of milliseconds. That's important for some kinds of applications, but not for everything. The next problem is being able to offer speeds and sort of capacity that are comparable to what you'd see with fiber services today. For that, we propose to build many satellites that have multiple satellites in view, and they're highly intelligent satellites. They can focus their beams at very small areas, allow them to reuse the frequencies that they have very efficiently. That allows us to serve more customers with higher speeds and adapt our capacity where the demand rises and falls. We're also, I think, uniquely situated because we've got this heritage of applying real innovation to manufacturing, both to the spacecraft. We'll be developing satellites that have not been seen before and deploying them using the reusable launch capability that can help us not only deploy quickly but also more cheaply. So our goal is to provide fiber-like services at market prevailing prices with a different construct of a satellite architecture.
You noted in your testimony that the last broadband infrastructure programs, in the last broadband infrastructure program, satellite received less than 2% of stimulus money. What led to that, and how do you think we need to change in whatever we do next?
I would answer that in two ways. The first is, I think satellite architectures need a little bit of conceptualization to make them parallel to their terrestrial counterparts. A satellite terminal looks a lot like a cable modem in sort of its function. It's on the consumer premise. If there's a program that encourages or offsets the cost at the consumer's home for the equipment they need to get internet, there's no reason why you couldn't include a satellite equivalent. A gateway is equivalent to a router or a switch or a POP. It's part of the network equivalent. I think in the past, being able to apply those to the spacecraft themselves was a conceptual construct that we just never got to. So that was part of the hard work to do, is just to say this is a different kind of architecture and needs to be sort of aligned with what terrestrial is. The second is that the satellite services need to be equivalent to the kinds of services that anyone would get in other kinds of areas that are served with other technologies. And that's incumbent on us to provide.
Does the statutory framework allow for the FCC to do this, or does this require legislation?
I think it'll be determined by what program it is that we're talking about.
Okay. Mr. Hendricks,
We'd love to work with you on that.
Of the regulatory challenges that you've discussed today, what would you recommend that the committee work on?
Well, I think in the long run, as both Chairman Thune and Ranking Member Nelson mentioned, the net neutrality issue is one that is a big challenge. I get in the current climate how difficult the conversations are, but we've been running on this regulatory hamster wheel for about 10 years now, and we've gone through several iterations of stop, start, stop, start. As a technologist, which is what Nokia does, those kinds of regulatory shocks change dramatically the product development that we are doing, where you assume you can do things like analytics and look at application-specific prioritization, and then poof, you can't. And so Congress settling once and for all what it believes the FCC's authority is and how that authority should be operationalized is a very preferable solution, I think, for most of industry. And I'm maybe a little more optimistic that we can get there, because I think there's a lot more we agree on than not. I think that's an area. I think we'll have to take a wait-and-see approach to what happens after, if the FCC carries forward with the net neutrality NPRM that was put forward. You will then again have, by virtue of the reclassification of broadband services, a common privacy framework that applies to all services. It's a reasonable conversation at that point to have about whether or not you think what the FTC framework does is the right framework for everyone. But then at least you're back on a technology neutral standing. So Congress may have an opportunity to look at that as well. And I think I identified mostly what I thought were things you shouldn't do, or that you have to be very cautious in doing, particularly as you consider things like tax reform, because I think those challenges are going to be difficult to overcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Schatz. Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member. So I'm from Nevada, and we have challenges like everyone else with respect to access to rural broadband. So I'm very excited to hear and have this discussion today, and so thank you for all being here. Mr. Hendricks, you made a number of references in your testimony to smart cities. And this is an area that I'm very interested in working on, and I'm glad you raised it. I'm curious, did you partner with a community under the DOT challenge last year?
I would have to check. I don't recall doing that. One thing I will say is I think Nevada has been probably the most forward-leaning customer that we have dealt with in our discussions. It is very clear from the governor to the legislature to the members of Congress that there is an interest in making Nevada an attractive place for tech investment, and we've had a lot of fabulous conversations with cities about doing smart city deployment kind of work.
And this is why I bring it up, and I'm grateful that, Mayor, you're here as well as a representative. I've worked in state and local government, and I think there is an opportunity at the federal level to help incentivize and incentivize local, state, private sector to come together down a path. And I think in Nevada, our future is in technology and in promoting technology, and you see that happening. And that's why I bring up the smart cities. This is an issue that I'm interested in looking at federal dollars to help incentivize communities to really go down this path, both rural and our urban areas. And I'm curious if that's something that you would be interested in seeing in the future as well.
Yes, I think very much. In my testimony, I described that I think to the extent that there will be funds available for fiscal activities in an infrastructure bill or another context, Nokia very much would like to see priority given to those verticals, including smart cities. And I think there's an opportunity there. One of our biggest challenges isn't dealing with unreasonable cities, it's dealing with cities that may not have a process at all. And so you can condition participation and receipt of some of those dollars on adoption of a comprehensive zoning ordinance for these kinds of things to facilitate it. So there are some incentives that can be built in that I don't think have to be punitive in their nature, but we very much support funding for those kind of verticals.
And so, because I only have a short amount of time, and I would love to hear also from you, Mayor, as well as Representative Weninger, and let me add this to the discussion. Because of my background in working in local and state, there are often times when what you do, and you talked about zoning issues, infrastructure issues, you know your community better than everyone, and not every community is the same.
Right.
And when we're looking at going down the path in federal legislation and what we need in this space, I want to make sure that we at the federal level are coordinating and listening with our local governments, our state governments, and the private sector in each community. But I find as I jump into this area, there are too many organizations that are out there. Nobody's talking or communicating. I know that we have a Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee created by the FCC chair, as well as the Broadband Opportunity Council and a number of other committees who are all focused on addressing and solving these issues we are currently facing. And these various committees each have the same intent, but have vastly different makeup, and they're not always talking and sharing the same data. Would it be simpler if we just designated a lead federal agency that really focused on addressing and bringing in those local governments and state governments and private sector to address these issues? Or I would be curious about your thoughts on how we make sure we have that level of vertical communication and that we're all sharing information to the benefit of our communities and the technology that we want to promote.
Go, or you want me to?
I can go real quick. Senator, you make some great points, and I too I was a city councilman, and now where I'm at the state legislature, so I kind of see all sides of it, including I own restaurants, so I've gone through zoning and different things. I think one of the tough problems is that there's this old paradigm of you have this break between the electeds and then you have the people who are in the zoning department who definitely, I mean, they fought us the hardest. But the electeds wanted it. I guess it's different than what the mayor's saying, because they don't want to have every council meeting and have somebody down there, you know, the place fills up because they're putting up a large macro cell tower. And so they like this kind of being off their plate. But I think you make a great point on the smart cities part, because also too often cities always think that everything the planning department has to be paid for by fees. And I've never believed that, because you zone a Walmart or whatever and you have sales tax coming in that's generating money for the city to pay those salaries. And the amount of money and just on the Internet of Things that can be generated just for private business, but then not only that, for the cities, through smart cities, through efficiencies, where they're going to save money, where they don't have to go check every water meter or the trash cans kind of things that are coming, is enormous. I mean, and that's just going to get bigger. So, yeah, if there can be some organization speaking with one voice, or the Senate, you know, and the Congress speaking with one voice, and interact with the cities, and I think it's just kind of an education process of breaking these old paradigms and how business has been done for so long.
Mm-hmm. Senator, first of all, I do appreciate your comments, and you're right on. Actually, my father lived in Nevada for 20 years, and I spent a lot of time there, and I've seen some of the communities that have excellent broadband service, and other communities in Nevada and in Florida as well that don't have the competitive choices that we all deserve. There are a lot of barriers now that have nothing to do with local regulations, but unfortunately these are programs that have been in place for many, many years, particularly by the federal government, that do prohibit innovation and deployment of technology. For example, there are communities, including mine, that are undergoing major roadway construction projects using federal dollars. When my city undertook a several $1 million roadway construction project on Dixie Highway, which is a major road through my city, we wanted to install conduit. Very simple. We just thought it would be used by the industry for broadband purposes, and if we can install it as part of this construction project, pay the labor and extra material costs, which were minimal, that this would be a win-win. But the federal funds that were funding that construction project prohibited us from doing that. And that exists with respect to a lot of federal programs, as well as a lot of state programs. A lot of times we're doing these construction projects with state dollars, and you can't use those funds to support dark fiber and conduit, which is silly, really. And so those are some of the things that we should look at eliminating. With respect to the committees and which organizations should take the lead on coordinating all of these efforts, it just seems that right now, I think some organizations have a goal in mind and then set up a committee to reach that goal without really wanting to go through an honest process, unfortunately. We're very concerned, for example, the FCC's Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee, which I think one of my colleagues here is on. But I think that committee's goal is to adopt or suggest local ordinances for cities and counties to adopt to support the deployment of broadband technology. The problem is there's only 1 out of 29 members on that committee who's a local official. So the local officials are going to be very skeptical about anything that committee comes out with. And another committee of the FCC, the Intergovernmental Advisory Committee, which I chaired until 2016, the governor of Connecticut is the chair of that committee, and she requested that the FCC appoint somebody from the IAC to serve on this Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee, but that did not happen. So I know the National League of Cities is working now with industry members, with stakeholders from counties, from states, and they've created a task force to try and come up with basically an education package for local officials around the country. And I'm sure that they would be willing to work with any stakeholders in this area to support broadband deployment in a more effective way. You look at municipal broadband as well. There are communities that the only way they will get broadband service is if the municipality makes the investment. Right. In Florida, as well as in states throughout the country, that is prohibited. So you have some policies in place, either on a state and on a federal level, that prohibit the type of investment that local governments want to make sure that their residents do have access to competitive broadband choices, but are prohibited from doing so by existing policies.
Great. Thank you very much, and thank you for allowing me to go over.
Thank you, Kath. Thank you, Senator Masto. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to each of the witnesses for being here and joining us at this hearing today. Mr. Downs, there was some discussion earlier today about the FCC and the regulation of the Internet. As you know, the Internet arose in a very light-touch regulatory environment, and indeed much of the reason why we've seen such incredible free speech and free enterprise and opportunity is because innovation did not require prior approval from federal government regulations, but rather the Internet has been a haven for freedom. That changed 2 years ago when the FCC for the first time asserted its authority to regulate the Internet as a Title II public utility, treating the Internet under authority that was designed in a very different context for some 80 years ago and not designed with the Internet in mind. In my view, that decision was lawless. It was a power grab from the FCC, and it was profoundly dangerous for a federal regulatory agency to assert the authority to regulate pricing and terms of service on the Internet. One of the great virtues of the Internet has been innovation without prior government regulation. Chairman Pai has wisely stated his intention to reverse that lawless power grab. Could you tell this committee, Mr. Downs, in your judgment, what are the benefits to ensuring that the Internet remains in a light-touch regulatory environment without federal regulators demanding pre-approval before innovation?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Senator Cruz. So in my filings on the 2015 order, I shared your view that the net neutrality aside, the principles aside, the real issue was public utility reclassification, and that was my chief concern with the 2015 order. I don't think we have to look any further than our counterparts, particularly in Europe, where permissionless innovation has not been the starting point. And in my research on disruptive innovation, what we find is that because the speed of change, particularly with digital technology, but lots of other technologies, genomic technologies and materials technologies, the pace of change is so rapid in a good way that even the best intended regulatory oversight can unintentionally get in the way. And my view was that the reclassification of public utility was a very dangerous move in that regard, in that it could have led to, as you say, rate regulation, other kinds of things that were there now forbeared from, but could have been unforbeared from in some future administration. So I shared that concern, and I continue to share that concern.
And I will commend you for introducing the word unforbeared from to this committee. That may be a first, but indeed it is a danger well to be worried about. Let me shift to a different topic. Mayor Resnick, earlier this year our committee held a hearing on examining ways to improve our nation's infrastructure. And at that hearing, I asked witnesses if deploying small cell networks, employing 5G wireless technology, could serve as an important component to improving infrastructure. The mayor of Miami Beach, Philip Levine, responded by saying, quote, "Whether it's telecommunications or bridges or tunnels and roads, Congress could appropriate $1 trillion, but nothing will ever get done because the process is absolutely broken at the permitting level. I don't care if it's telecom or a new road, the process is broken. It's not even about the money, it's about the process. It needs to be streamlined. We're in a race with the rest of the world. We're all wearing handcuffs and weights. It's priority number one, and I see it as a mayor." Do you agree with Mayor Levine? Is the process at the permitting level a major barrier to effective infrastructure deployment?
Well, thank you, Senator. And actually, Mayor Levine and I are good friends, and his city is.
I figured that was the case.
And they're dealing with tremendous issues in Miami Beach, including sea level rise and flooding, and having a good chunk of their property basically underwater as opposed to waterfront in a couple of years, as is my city. So we're all dealing with a lot of challenges. I don't think permitting is broken. I think with respect to this new technology, as I stated in my remarks, it's a disruptive force. We haven't had experience dealing with it before. We need to educate our staffs and local officials throughout the country on how to properly deal with the technology. We are in the process now in Florida, and actually Miami Beach was one of the first in Florida to do this. We are updating our local codes to address the new technology, particularly for access to our rights-of-way, because that hasn't occurred before. But there is nothing in place now that would prohibit the deployment of new small cell technology in our rights-of-way. And we are moving forward to support that technology. We just need some more education and, frankly, a little bit of time to update our codes. The bill that, for example, passed in Arizona will go a long way in doing that, but we are also very concerned with preemption because there are other communities that have achieved this through agreements. For example, San Antonio, Arizona is considered a model around the country for having an excellent agreement with Verizon that then has been used by that city and others as models with other providers around the country. If the federal or state government preempts local jurisdiction with respect to these issues, they'll prohibit us from entering into those types of win-win agreements with the providers. So we have to be cautious about basically preempting local authority and discretion as well, because then you'll preempt these types of win-win scenarios that can be achieved. I don't know.
Mr. Chairman, could I possibly address that real quick?
Just in a brief moment, yes.
Okay. Yes, I just respectfully disagree. Our legislation puts a 75-day shot clock, puts normal fees, and I went through earlier some just really crazy year-long processes. We had 9 master agreements done by Verizon that took 3 years to get done. Technology is passing you by that point, and I just think this infrastructure is critical. We did it unanimously in Arizona. There's a way of getting it done where you still protect those local rights, but allow them to deploy this technology in a very efficient, fast manner. We also did batching to where if they do have a problem, they come in batches of 25 that they're putting in. If they do have a problem with 2 or 3 of those, they can take those out and the process goes a little longer, and then the others are moving efficiently through the process at that time.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. I think we all agree that investment in broadband infrastructure has broad bipartisan support. And there's a simple reason. Obviously, it's the engine of innovation in our society, a job-creating machine. It's chaotic. It's entrepreneurial. It goes right to the enterprise identity of our country. But we always have to try to strike a balance. And so in 2015, the broadband companies, the wireless companies, invested $87 billion in new infrastructure upgrades. That's great, and that's what we want. But at the same time, 1/2 of all venture capital in the United States went to software and internet-specific startups. That is, companies which rely upon net neutrality to guarantee that they can reach all 320 million people in America for their business model that they are trying to create. So that's a nice balance. $87 billion in infrastructure upgrade, 1/2 of all venture capital goes into software and internet-specific startups. Perfect balance. So my question is, do each of you believe in a free and open internet? Yes or no? Ms. Cooper?
We are not yet a service provider, and we expect that we're going to be subject to the rules of the commission when we do provide service in a few years. And we expect that the rules are going to have many twists and turns as Congress, the commission, and the courts continue to look at this.
Yeah, so, so yes and no. Yes, you do? You believe in a free and open internet?
We're not yet an internet service provider, sir.
Oh, I see, okay. Well, let me just say that I have here a document here from 800 innovators, startups, businesses from all 50 states, 800 of them, who have sent a letter calling for the retaining of the net neutrality rules so that they will be able to continue to be job creators in this environment. And that's the tension here, because in the absence of a guarantee, you can't raise the money from the venture capitalists in order to reach their customers if you're going to be dependent upon the broadband carriers to be able to provide the services. So to the extent to which we all agree that there should be more broadband, there should be. And $87 billion of investment says we're heading in that direction. To the extent to which new companies want to get in, we shouldn't have laws that prohibit them from getting in at the city and town level. They should be able to get in. They should be able to provide the services. Broadband companies don't like that either. They want to shut down that kind of competition. There's no question about it. What they also want to do, broadband companies, is they want to kind of monetize the privacy of Americans. And we just had a successful effort by the Republicans to pass a Congressional Review Act repeal of the privacy laws that had been built by the FCC into law in order to protect consumers so that you could not sell their information if permission was not received from a consumer. Do each of you believe that there should be a protection of privacy that a broadband provider actually is required to provide, so that you have to receive permission before you can sell that information? Mr. Resnick.
Well, Senator, actually, when I was chair of the FCC's Intergovernmental Advisory Committee, we took up these issues and we supported unanimously the net neutrality order as well as the privacy rules that were put in place.
I appreciate it. Yeah. Mr. Weninger.
Senator, respectfully, this really isn't my wheelhouse.
Okay, that's fine. Mr. Hendricks.
Although not a service provider, we do absolutely support consumer privacy protections, just not the ones the FCC had adopted.
Mr. Downs.
Yes, I agree. The framework that the FTC has used for years, which is opt-in, has worked extremely well. For opt-out, which has worked extremely well. What the FCC wanted to do was opt-in, and I don't think that was a good idea.
Yeah. Ms. Cooper.
As we design our constellation, we're committed to building a system that can protect the privacy and security of our customers.
Yeah. Well, obviously, the problem with opt-out is that, by definition, they've got all your information and they're using it unless you opt out. Whereas with opt-in, they've actually got to come to you and say, may I have your permission to use all of the financial data that our company has gathered about you? Healthcare data about your daughter searching for information about anorexia at age 13, that you have to get their permission, the family permission, before you start selling that information to 50 companies that might want to start advertising right there on that site towards that 13-year-old girl. So there's a big difference between opt-in and opt-out. The FCC, I think, had it right. Okay, people are buying this service, the broadband service. It's expanding dramatically. Privacy is now basically for sale across our country, and these are the most sensitive pieces of information about a family that can be obtained. So we're going to have to just continue to have a national fight over this issue, because I think it's as fundamental an issue as we have in our country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Peters.
Thank you, Senator Gardner, and thank you to all of our panelists today for your testimony. It's in my mind, before we embark on any kind of comprehensive infrastructure package, we need to have a real complete picture of the landscape that we're dealing with. And as many of you know, this committee passed the Mobile Now Act last January, which I think was an important step, one step of what will be many steps to help that and facilitate that knowledge. One provision of the bill that would establish a database of federal communications facility installations. In fact, I sponsored an amendment to that provision which would require agencies to help states and localities contribute to this database with information about their own broadband assets. Having the database include federal, local, and state data certainly will make it more comprehensive and a better tool for stakeholders to make these kinds of decisions. However, this database only covers assets owned by federal, state, and local governments. We still face challenges in understanding and mapping the scope of private assets, although sometimes it can be even easier to deploy broadband on private lands. And I believe private and public should seek to constantly learn from and help one another. And so the federal government should do everything possible, certainly to streamline, but also need private cooperation to understand and how we can act more quickly. So, Mr. Resnick, my question is to you. A report last year by the FCC's Intergovernmental Advisory Committee, which of course you chair, found that the FCC lacks the data on the location of wireless towers and other facilities, the providers who use each tower, and other information that would streamline local and federal decision making. So if you could take a moment and describe further the challenges that we face with collecting this data and creating the comprehensive map necessary for broadband service, and then also in your work if you have seen any models that would be helpful in dealing with this situation.
Well, thank you, Senator. I do appreciate the question, and that is correct. That was an important component of the report that the IAC issued in, I think, December of 2016, so it's recent. We were actually quite stunned and surprised that the FCC did not have data as to what facilities were out there that would be available for co-location for providers to use. We just assumed this is an agency tasked to do this, and they're all specialists, and they spend a tremendous amount of time researching the industry and researching what facilities are existing, and they don't have any of this information. And because there's several reasons. One, not all towers are required to be registered. There's only actually a very small percentage of towers that are required to be registered. It has to do with the location and the size of the towers. And often even the industry doesn't know what facilities are out there that might be possible for co-location. There are some local governments that have, in their local codes, mandated that all providers and infrastructure companies register their facilities with the local governments. And there's usually no fee for such registration or a nominal fee just to cover the administrative costs with maintaining that database. And that has been useful both for regulators and first responders who need to know where these facilities are, as well as for the industry members that are looking to co-locate equipment on these facilities. So I think that would be incredibly helpful throughout the entire country, and I'm sure National League of Cities and other government organizations could work with their partners to try and come up with models that might be appropriate for the federal government to look at. But thank you, sir.
Great, appreciate that. Any other panelists that would like to comment on that?
Just very briefly, Senator, I would say that I agree. Nokia is a major provider of the infrastructure and a partner in the FirstNet project that's going forward. We saw firsthand that it's very difficult sometimes to know what assets were out there, both land mobile radio towers, private towers, and other things, what state of readiness and whether they have been hardened. That information, in our experience, exists in various places. There are system integrators that build networks for companies. There should be a model where we can cooperatively share that information and improve the picture, I think.
Great. Yes, ma'am.
I'd just like to add more generally that the knowledge of any transmitter is a valuable piece of information, particularly as you expect different technologies to share spectrum, to operate and coexist. Whether that's the method that's applicable for every technology maybe remains to be determined, but I do think that the knowledge of locations is an important piece of the prospect of spectrum efficiency and sharing.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Peters. Mr. Chairman, I think I'll yield myself 5 minutes. All right. Thank you. There's a lot of temptation sitting at this seat. Make a lot of decisions, but the biggest temptation is this muffin that's sitting right here in front of me. I'm quite sure you had that set up. Anyway, I want to thank the panel for being here and taking time. A lot of good insight, a lot of good history, and I certainly know that this is an issue that's very important to my state. I certainly appreciate the other senator from Nevada that was here earlier and her questioning, and I know this is just as important to our chairman here in South Dakota as it is in the state of Nevada. But I want to share real quickly, briefly, a success story that we have in the state of Nevada, and it's an electric company called Valley Electric Association. It's located in a small city just outside of Las Vegas called Pahrump. Most people do think of it as just an electric company, but they have a great story about their recent success in broadband deployment. They partnered with a company out of Las Vegas called Switch, and I'm certain that most of you are familiar with Switch, where they were able to run a 1 gig fiber option line from Las Vegas to Reno. I don't know that I've heard of any other 1 gig fiber optic highway that runs nearly 500 miles through some of the smallest rural communities that we have in the state. And I would argue that there aren't even urban areas in the state of Nevada that have this kind of access for their schools, their hospitals, and even some of their residents. But Valley Electric helped engineer this path. They prepared the poles, they submitted the applications to get all this done. And it's because they saw a bigger picture. And this invitation that I had to spend time with them, they went through this and the success that they were able to see. They do know this, that if communities don't have broadband, the people will leave. And that has been a concern for the rural portions of our state. You can't operate a school, you can't operate a hospital, or a business. We have communities in our state that you can't even swipe a debit card because they don't have access. But the fiber route that they prepared is like a highway. So, and most of you are aware of this, you need off-ramps. And so they're building those broadband off-ramps, and they're facing some serious barriers. So they have the fiber, but it's the off-ramps now that are causing the problems, and their problems mostly come with the Bureau of Land Management. Sandy Valley, Nevada is a good example. They already have the electric lines that were permitted into that valley. They just need to add the cables for broadband. And it's taken 10 months of filing the application, and yet after 10 months, they still do not have approval. Federal agencies like BLM are hamstringing private companies that are using their own money to invest and expand infrastructure into places no one else wants to expand. Valley Electric will face the same challenges in Armagosa Valley, Beatty, Nevada, and every rural town that DC has probably never heard of, but ones that most of us have visited at one time or another in our own states. I believe that people in these communities deserve broadband, and Valley Electric told me that the delayed applications from the federal land agencies is the #1 barrier to broadband deployment. So I have legislation I'm working on with the chairman that will streamline the federal permitting process. Mr. Hendricks, you mentioned that in your testimony, and I appreciate your comments. And most important, to ensure that there's a shot clock that these federal agencies have to abide by. Mr. Weninger, you mentioned that in your own legislation back in Arizona and the difference that that made. I agree with you and believe that we should do that at the next level, which is our level. So I guess I want to start with Mr. Downs and ask if these federal agency complaints that I get from the state of Nevada, are they common across the country?
So,
at least in the western portion.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. And the funny thing is, I think my understanding is that much of the fiber infrastructure for California is actually built just on the Nevada side of the border, because the California people made it even more difficult than in Nevada. So there's no question that a lot of these delays have no public interest value whatsoever. And again, shot clocks, I mean, even the shot clocks that exist right now in wireless, they're very generous in terms of how many days that they are. And I think, yeah, certainly in the western United States, in the Intermountain region, where obviously most of the land, or much of the land, is federally owned, not surprisingly, that's the complaints you hear most are about federal management.
Mr. Downs, is this an issue with process, or is it an issue with resources, or is it just an accountability issue that we're dealing with some of these agencies?
Well, it's some of all of those. It really depends on, who you're talking about and where you're talking about. In a lot of cases, there are no processes. A lot of cases, certainly, there is resource constraint as well. Obviously, federal agencies as well as municipalities, they don't really have competition per se. So if you're not getting your permits done as quickly as you'd like from them, it's not like you're going to go somewhere else to get them. And I think that's actually where the solution comes in. As I say, the best incentive is to build up sort of competitive spirit. And we saw how Google did that so brilliantly in the initial rollout of Google Fiber, getting all those cities to compete, not by offering money, not by offering tax incentives, but by offering to streamline their processes, appoint a single point of reference, give access to city buildings and other property. And I think as the states and the localities start to recognize the real economic opportunity that 5G and next generation wired internet provides, you're going to start to see more of that, these locations will say, we want that development here, we want to be leaders in that, and they will suddenly discover just how much better a job they can do, even given the resource constraints they have.
Yeah, but my problem when I talk about process is with the government agencies themselves. It doesn't matter, Nevada's 110,000 square miles. It doesn't matter which community I go to, they will tell me that their BLM office is the worst when it comes to dealing with that. And I'm going to guess that it's true in any other state that I go to. But right now, I'll tell you that Pahrump believes that the office in Las Vegas is the worst in the country because they can't get these applications through. How do we hold these agencies accountable?
So my experience, Senator, is certainly more at the local and state level, not with the BLM and other agencies. But you control the power of the purse, and that's where you can hurt them or get them where you want them. Again, minimum requirements for how quickly they deal with things, and penalties, I suppose, to the extent that Congress can implement them for agencies that just don't follow the rules that are set up, particularly with their reasonable rules.
Now, Mr. Weninger, you served with my son-in-law in the legislature.
Yes, I did, Senator. I know your daughter.
Have you solved these problems in Arizona, the problems that we're seeing in Nevada? What processes did you go through, not only for your own legislation, but what did you do to overcome? Because you have as much public lands as we do, at least close. How are you able to overcome some of these federal agencies and able to implement some of the programs that you've been successful at doing?
It's difficult. Basically, ours probably isn't going to affect the BLM land. We will still have to deal with that. But one thing we did is, on the legislation we did, is we put a shot clock within the shot clock. So you have to tell us within 20 days whether or not the application is complete or not. Because we don't want you running clear up to 70 days and say, well, no, we don't have everything. But then that's within the 75 days, so it's not in addition to. And so I think that helps a lot. But we have the same problems you do. I think somebody else mentioned it's because so much of our land is federal land that we're kind of held captive by that in the West.
Thanks for the question. I sit in the chair, so I got to go 8 or 9 minutes, right, Mr. Chairman? Mrs. Klobuchar.
All right, thank you to both of you, and thank you. I apologize for being late. We had a Judiciary Committee hearing with FBI Director Comey, so I'll try to use the same tone with all of you that all the other senators were using in that hearing. I'm just kidding. Okay, so I have been pushing hard for a competitive agenda for this country, and I'm so glad that we launched the Senate Broadband Caucus, which includes myself as chairs, Capito, King, Heinrich, and Bozeman. And I really see it as a broadband infrastructure challenge of our time. My favorite story of the week was hearing when I was in northern Minnesota about a cancer doctor who for years when he couldn't be at the hospital and he would be sent something at home about a patient in some kind of urgent situation, he would have to go to the McDonald's parking lot to look at x-rays. Okay, this happened in northern Minnesota, in a pretty mid-sized town, not a small town. So those are the kinds of things we're encountering. So we're pushing hard to get funding, whether it is changes to the Universal Service Fund, whether it is this major broadband infrastructure discussion that we're having, and I've gotten both Secretary Mills and Secretary Chow have committed that it should be part of any infrastructure package. We're hoping we hear from the White House about specific infrastructure package. The Senate has a package that's $1 trillion with a major internet component, and I just think we need to get this done. So I'm going to start with something more specific, and that is I've advanced broadband legislation to make deployment more easy by requiring transportation and broadband providers during construction to just dig once. And this legislation passed the Commerce Committee in, it's called the Mobile Now Act. It passed in January. Mr. Downs, you testified that dig once policies can reduce the cost of deploying fiber under highways in urban areas by up to 33% and up to 16% in rural areas. Would those kinds of savings make some high-cost areas more economical to serve?
Absolutely, and thank you, Senator Klobuchar. It's good to see you again. So, look, I can't think of any reason, and I can't find anybody who doesn't agree with the idea of dig once. It really just makes so much sense. And those numbers that I gave in my testimony came from the GAO. I think they're quite solid. So, absolutely, if we bring down the cost by putting that conduit in place, then we can put the fiber in. It can only be to a benefit. I can't think of any reason not to do it.
Okay, thanks. Something else, I just keep looking for ways to show, especially some of our urban friends, what the gap that we're seeing is in rural areas, and yet cost of living in rural is lower. There's reasons we want to have people just live throughout our country and not just in congested areas. And we also have a lot of cool businesses being developed there, and that's been the heart of our economy, the way we're able to develop small businesses and then they grow, but they can't without broadband. I was actually at one business in a small town where there's not good enough broadband, and she's up to like 25 employees. She makes chains for chain jewelry. She has to have her sales staff located, 100 miles away or so in Fargo, because they have internet there. And so then she's able to communicate with them by phone. So Senators Capito and Sullivan and I have introduced this bill to conduct an analysis of the effects of broadband deployment and adoption on the U.S., asking the Commerce Department to do that. Mr. Resnick, with your experience with the National League of Cities, would better economic data help mayors and other community leaders make the case for investing in broadband deployment?
Thank you, Senator. Yes, absolutely. We're always trying to measure the economic development effects of infrastructure. It's not something that a lot of local governments are easily accomplished to tackle. And so if the federal government could support that effort, absolutely. If we could show the benefits of broadband technology in terms of our economic development, I think it would encourage investment, not only by local governments and state governments, but also probably by the private sector as well.
Okay, thank you very much. This one's for you, Mr. Hendricks. Broadband infrastructure deployment can often be hampered by slow and redundant permitting processes, particularly when it comes to infrastructure siting on federal lands. For those rural and tribal residents living near federal land, this inefficient process can be the difference between living in an unserved community and modern broadband access. I've been working to streamline this process, and there's some provisions in this Mobile Now bill I just referred to that would improve permitting and encourage deployment on federal lands by developing a common form for applications and establishing a clear point of contact with federal agencies. Could you talk about some of the primary obstacles that the broadband service providers that your company works with faces when trying to deploy broadband infrastructure on federal lands?
Well, to be fair, I think we we have much more experience when it comes to deploying in city centers, but we do obviously work with providers across a range of jurisdictions. You've noted several provisions in the Mobile Now Act. By the way, we fully support all of those provisions that you have put in there. Shot clocks, response times, the requirement for individual applications for individual cells as opposed to figuring out a way to aggregate and consider multiple sites at a time, which also requires you to do multiple impact studies. Those things begin to layer in cost. And so we certainly support the idea of shot clocks and taking a look at other ways to incentivize, perhaps even making clear to BLM and others that you have this authority, use it or lose it. At some point, we're going to deem granted some of these applications if you don't, give the proper attention to them.
Okay, very good. I note that most of the rest of my questions, they say Senator Nelson asked this, Senator Cortez, so I will not use the usual senator theme of just being redundant anyway, and I will turn this over to Senator Blumenthal, my colleague. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. I, too, will try to avoid being redundant. I know you've been asked a lot of questions about net neutrality and some about broadband privacy. The threat to net neutrality and privacy on the internet, I think, are two of the most profound challenges we face. They've been set back in recent weeks by Republican colleagues, by pronouncements from Chairman Pai and by President Trump, which, in my view, have undermined essential values of both privacy and an open internet that are key to investment in broadband. According to a recent study by the Pew Research Center, 91% of adults agree or strongly agree that, quote, consumers have lost control of how personal information is collected and used by companies. Another study found that nearly half of American internet users avoid online activities, including online purchases and civic activities, due to their security and privacy concerns. That apprehension on the part of Americans certainly inhibits investment in broadband, in infrastructure, in all of the communications technology that is vital to our future economically, not to mention in quality of life. So let me ask you, Mr. Hendricks, do you think that these threats to privacy are good for investment in the internet, or on the contrary, are obstacles?
One of the things that Nokia, as a technologist, thinks a lot about is where we'll be in the next 5 to 10 years with the Internet of Things and the connected programmable world. And we talk a lot about trustworthiness as an important metric for people in uptake and use of those technologies, because more and more of those technologies are going to require you to put more and more of your physical, financial, and personal life at risk. And so it is something that we think a great deal about. We are constantly talking in the design of our products. How do we make them more secure by design? How do we incorporate privacy protections? And I think we've contributed a lot to the policy conversation in town about how you do that. I think the one thing that I hope comes out of our participation in that debate is we think that it is a good thing to talk about enhanced privacy protections regularly. Our big concern with what the FCC did was that it began to make distinctions between sectors of this ecosystem who could use information one way and not another. And so I think our concern is, let's take a fresh look at how we can potentially improve privacy protections across all sectors, because we don't yet know how this marketplace is evolving. Service providers are becoming content providers. Edge companies are becoming service providers. We have to make sure that we develop these protections robust but technology neutral.
Well, I've introduced a bill, it's called My Data, the Managing Your Data Against Telecom Abuses Act, along with Senator Udall, it endeavors to protect this data by enabling the public sector and the government to be more effective in protecting this kind of data and enhancing confidence in exactly the systems that you just mentioned. The legislation ensures that the FTC's jurisdiction in the Internet ecosystem includes broadband providers, a loophole that now exists in the current law, and I hope that members of this panel and the companies and interests you represent will support this legislation, because I think it's important to your interests, the public's interests, the industry's interests, and restoring consumer privacy and data security across all Internet platforms. So thank you very much for being here today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. It has been a great discussion, and we really do welcome and appreciate your input. I think this lends a lot to the conversation that we're having about the best way to increase a more rapid deployment of this technology across the country, so that we can pursue not only high-speed internet services and broadband in areas of the country that don't receive it today, but as we look at 5G and everything we need to do to stay ahead of the curve there, we want to get there first, and that requires obviously an awful lot of work on the part of at every level of government. So we've heard from several state and local leaders today, as well as those that are working in the industry to make all this happen. Final question, just to close it out. In Mobile Now, as you probably know, we address some of the issues regarding deployment and federal agencies. I'm wondering if there's anything that Congress can do to get folks to work together in delivering broadband services to our communities in a reasonable amount of time, in addition to what we're doing with respect to the federal piece of this in the Mobile Now bill. So any final pieces of advice or suggestions as we try to move quickly in putting policies in place and creating conditions that are favorable to the build-out that we need to see? Yes, Ms. Cooper.
The frequencies that are enormously valuable, KU band, KA band, and V band, the rules for many of these frequency bands that will carry next generation broadband services, including by satellite, are immature and in some cases out of date. And it's very important to ensure that as those rules and allocations are considered, that the technologies that can reach Americans with broadband are considered as part of those allocations. We consider satellite to be offer real promise for broadband access. We want to make sure that in those bands, satellite services are considered. Thank you.
Senator, I would just add, I know we weren't talking specifically about spectrum today, but obviously, as you know, the most valuable now spectrum that's available, that's underutilized or unused, is held by federal government agencies. And we need to do a much better job of offering the right kinds of incentives, the right kinds of carrots and sticks to get some of that either shared or freed up for next generation applications.
I would add to that, Mr. Chairman. I'm sure that members of the Senate tire of hearing of the spectrum issue, because it seems like every year you get a wish list from industry about doing spectrum things. As the technologists, the reason that spectrum remains an important and critical topic on an ongoing basis is because the more bands that are made available to us as researchers and developers of the technology, the more flexible the infrastructure is that we can develop for carriers of all size, rural ones, large ones. Different bands with different characteristics have different deployment scenarios. So continuing to work on spectrum, and you've been excellent, is a core priority. So passing Mobile Now is a great step because of the 3 gigahertz spectrum that is in there. But I would encourage you to keep thinking and keep working on those spectrum issues, because the more options you give us, the better the solutions we can develop will be.
It does seem like almost every issue that comes in front of this committee comes back to that issue of how do we get more spectrum. So, thank you. Mr. Weninger.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I think you're off to a great start, and obviously I'm pretty proud of the legislation that a big team of ours put together, and if you used any of that on a national level, I think that would be incredible. I think some people just don't realize how quickly some of these companies and apps are scaling, and so I think it's very tough for the cell phone companies to predict, and they just need to keep building. I own restaurants, and right now, food delivery through an app is exploding. We have 4 different companies that we do it through, and it's adding on to our revenue every day. Also in my district, we have 4 different autonomous vehicle companies working in my district, which is mainly Chandler, and that's going to be on the same platform. And these things are coming so fast that if we don't really hurry this up, we're going to be left way behind the 8 ball. Thank you.
Thanks.
And Mr. Chairman, first of all, thank you again for the hearing today and for inviting us to participate. I would just request that local governments be part of the process in developing these policies. Ultimately, if facilities are going to be deployed, whatever type of facilities, from the small device that my colleague here showed you, I was actually going to bring a model of the 28 cubic foot cabinets that another company wants to install on our rights-of-way, but I couldn't get it on the plane. And I was going to have a blow-up model of it brought in, but that wouldn't have probably worked very well. But so they're not always so small. There are other. That's the problem with advances in broadband technology. It's not all the same, and local governments have to deal with these different types of technology that are now looking for access to the rights-of-way. I do not want a 28 cubic foot refrigerator sitting on the sidewalk in front of my house. No offense. I don't think you would want that either. So we do have to be part of the process to come up with solutions. And I do want to support, though, the comments that some of your Senator colleagues made today. There does need to be confidence in the technology. Broadband is a great technology, but it can be used for inappropriate purposes. I think every local government in the country by now has had a data breach, and they're tremendously disruptive. When our data is breached by somebody accessing our databases, our employee records, our customer records, tremendous impacts. The city of Fort Lauderdale shut down for 3 days because its internal data was breached. So I think that there does need to be greater confidence in the technology so that these inappropriate uses of broadband do not occur. And I think that would go a long way to support adoption. Thank you again.
Mr. Chairman, I detected a groan when I walked in the room, not necessarily by the witnesses, but by others, and including you. And so I will.
I thought I had my mic turned off. Sorry.
I will submit my questions in writing, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Thank you, Senator Mann. That was not a collective groan about you. But nonetheless, we appreciate that. We'll make sure that your questions are answered for the record. And I would just say to our witnesses again, thank you for being here, and we will keep the hearing record open. You will get questions for the record, and if you could respond to those as quickly as possible. We usually like to try and get that closed out within a couple weeks' time. That would be most appreciated. So with that, thank you again, and we'll continue this obviously conversation discussion. Hopefully, it'll lead beyond just a discussion, but really substantive steps forward in terms of how we address these issues and try and find that balance that was discussed today, work with the various entities of government to streamline, expedite, make it easier to get this technology out there and all the benefits that come with it. So thank you. This hearing is adjourned.